Ezra chapter 3 is where we're going to be this evening, and we're going to pick up our study in verse 2. Ezra chapter 3 and verse 2. Now, those of you who were here last Wednesday night, you may remember that we started out talking about the time of year that these events were taking place. We talked about the fact that we're introduced to this chapter taking place at the beginning of the 7th month of the year. The 7th month of the year was considered in many ways the most holy time of the year. It was the time when 3 mandatory feasts would take place. We talked about each one of those feast times and what their meaning was, what their symbolism to the Jews were. But where we left off last week, you may remember I mentioned the fact that now that this time has come, they have these 3 feasts that up to this point they've not been able to celebrate because they were away from Jerusalem. And so now they're trying to come up with what they're going to have to do, what's going to have to be constructed first in order for them to be able to celebrate these feasts in an appropriate fashion. So as we see there in verse 2, it says, "Then Jeshua the son of Jozadak and his brethren the priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and his brethren, arose and built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God." Now you may remember from our discussion last week, each one of these feasts required daily sacrifices to be offered. Now, those burnt offerings, according to the law of Moses, could only be offered where? At the temple. Could only be offered upon the altar in Jerusalem at the temple. And so it stands to reason that the first thing that they would want to restore would be what? Would be that altar. Because in order for them to offer those sacrifices, this altar has to be reconstructed. And so this is the first thing that they set out to complete. We find that this is going to be the first of the temple structures that is going to be completed. And it's interesting that they rebuild it back to the exact specifications as the altar was originally built, originally set forth in the law of Moses in Exodus 27, verses 1 through 8. So they're going back and they're following the same blueprint, so to speak. They're building it to the same dimensions in the exact same style as closely as possible as they can to the way it was originally. Now these offerings, we understand, could only be made in the places that God had directed. And so, during these times of feast, they could only be offered at Jerusalem. You remember there were 3 feasts each year that every Jewish male was required to travel to Jerusalem, offer sacrifices, and be there to take part in those feasts. The reason for that is because the directions for the observance of those feasts could not be carried out anywhere else. And so they could not offer sacrifices in their hometowns. They could not separate these feasts into different locations. These were intended to be times when the nation came together united, came together as one to honor God, to symbolize different things taking place through the year. We talked about that this was harvest time, and so most of the things that took place with these 3 feasts had some type of directive toward that time of harvest, praising God for the bounty of the harvest. But it could only be done in Jerusalem. Well, we find that after this altar was rebuilt, they immediately started offering sacrifices. And notice the text tells us, in verse 3 it says, "Though fear had come upon them because of the people of the countries, they set the altar on its bases, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord both the morning and evening." Burnt offerings. You see, they were afraid because, and we're going to see this more so as we get into Ezra chapter 4, but they are beginning to notice that these people that lived, especially in Samaria. Remember, Samaria was the land that was originally known as Israel, that was to the north of Judah. Those people didn't really like that these Jews had come back to Jerusalem. They didn't like that they were trying to restore their society. And many people believe the reason for that is because, after Israel had been destroyed, they were never given the right to go back and restore their country. And so those people that did eventually go back and resettle in Israel, which had come to be known as Samaria, they didn't like it when they saw their neighbors to the south getting to do things that God had not allowed them to do. And so they began to speak out against, to make threats against these Jews. And as we're going to see as we get into chapter 4, they're even going to get the Persians involved, and they're even going to facilitate the cease of the rebuilding process for a while. But we find that even though fear had already come upon the people, they were already afraid of what was going to happen. Remember last week we talked about the fact that much of this fear as well came from the fact that most of those who had come back to Jerusalem at this point were not military people. They weren't fighting men. These were religious leaders. These were the priests and the Levites and the temple servants. These weren't people that were used to entering into combat in any way. And so they were afraid at this threat, but nevertheless, their commitment was such that even though they were afraid, they continued working. They got the altar constructed, and they began immediately to offer those morning and evening sacrifices upon that altar. They trusted in God. They didn't wait on the coast to clear. They didn't wait on the people to give them a go-ahead. No, God is the one that had given them the go-ahead. God's the one that had told them to get to work. And so even though they were afraid, they obeyed God. And we're told that they continued throughout the entire 7th month of the year, keeping the feast that God had commanded. But also, you may remember, as we were talking about chapter 2, we talked about the vast sums of gold and silver that they had brought back. Well, notice here in chapter 3, it talks about that during this time also, they began to divvy out some of that money, some of that gold and silver. And they began to hire masons and carpenters. They began to purchase food and drink and oil, the things that they were going to need in order to survive. Because remember, were they supposed to go back and, enter into their trades? Were they supposed to go back and become farmers? Were they supposed to go back and immediately get their own personal lives back going? No. They were to go back and get the temple rebuilt. That was to be their main job. And so they had to have food and they had to have supplies in order to survive. But also, we see that they start amassing the supplies that they're going to need to build. They give silver and gold to the masons. They give it to the carpenters so they can start procuring stone. They can start obtaining logs. As we see, they began to give silver and gold to the people of Tyre and Sidon so that they could obtain cedar logs from Lebanon. Those would then be brought to Jerusalem. And the reason they were allowed to do that was because Cyrus had issued a decree allowing them to transact business with the king of Tyre. And so we see that they are going the extra mile in trying to do what God had instructed them to do. They are not letting grass grow under their feet. They're getting to work. They're trying to get this done as quickly as they can, even though they're anxious about how their neighbors are going to respond. At this point, they really don't know what lies ahead, but they know their neighbors don't like what they're doing. But one of the things that's truly amazing at this point, this was a united nation. You did not have one group of people trying to position themselves above another. You did not have different tribal entities any longer who were trying to say, well, my tribe is larger or stronger or greater than yours, or we have a better land possession than yours. No, when they came back from Babylon, they were a united group known as Jews. And so at this point, we find that they were united in their obedience and their courage and in the priorities that they had. But then when we come to verses 8 through 13, we find that work begins on the temple. It says, now, in the 2nd month of the 2nd year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, Jeshua the son of Jozadak, and the rest of the brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all those who had come out of captivity to Jerusalem, began work and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and above to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. So in the 7th month of the 1st year that they arrive, they rebuild the altar, they celebrate their feasts. But after this, no other work is done until we come to the 2nd month of the 2nd year. Folks, the reason for this is because in Jerusalem, there is a time of year, much like we are familiar with here, where construction is not easy to do. There is a time of year that, due to weather conditions and things of that nature, it made travel difficult. It made the shipment of supplies difficult. And so generally, it was what we would consider in the fall of the year. And so for them, that would have been their rainy season. That would have been the time that the weather conditions were the most uncertain. And so most of the time after the harvest, there really wasn't a whole lot that was done until after the first of the year. After the first of the year, they would then begin making their plans. They would begin getting ready to plant their crops. They would make preparations for obtaining the supplies they needed for their trades, whatever was necessary in order for them to get by for another year. Well, at this time, we find that every one of them, their job was to work on the temple. And so after the first of the year, when it becomes easier for these things to be brought in, it becomes more suitable for them to be able to work, construction begins. Now, this is also the same month of the year that workers began working on the original temple during the time of Solomon. And so some look at this and say that this is symbolic, that this was, they were doing this simply as a throwback to, well, the first temple started being built in the 2nd month of the year, so we're going to start building this temple in the 2nd month of the year. No, the reason for that was what I just mentioned. This was the opportune time. This was the best time of the year for that type of work to be done. And so that's when construction began on most any project that was being done, whether it was the temple, whether it was a house, whether it was a palace, a road, whatever the case may be. But we find that this was the same time of year that the first temple was being built. But we find that from the main leader all the way down to the least servant, they all had a job to do. They all got to work. There was not anyone in Jerusalem that was allowed to be idle. They had to get to work. We're told that the work was being overseen by the Levites, as we saw there in verse 9. And we're told that these men arose as one to oversee those working on the house of God. So there wasn't any disagreement among the leadership. There wasn't anyone who felt like, well, my plan is we need to do it this way or that way whatsoever. The reason for that is because they were following God's plans. They were carrying out what God had instructed them to do. But then once that foundation had been laid, there was a time of great celebration. It was overseen by the priests. And once again, we find that this celebration was patterned after the dedication of the foundation of the first temple, as we see in 2 Chronicles 5:11 through 13. Of course, the first time it was presided over by Solomon. This time it's being presided over by the priests who had come back to Jerusalem. What this is showing us, and I think this is something that's very important for us to remember as we move forward talking about the Jewish people. The Jewish people have never, in their history, even up to this day, viewed themselves as doing something new. Everything that they do, they look at that and say that it is hastening back to something in the past. And even if they develop what we would say is a new belief or a new practice or whatever, they say, no, we're not doing anything new. We are simply reforming something that is old. Because their mentality was always, our nation was established when the original temple was established. That was the height of their kingdom. That was the height of their strength. And so they look back to that time and they say, well, this is what we are basing everything upon. And so by looking at this and by saying, well, they're patterning everything after what was there before. What they're showing is that they were not developing something new. They were simply restoring what God had instructed them originally to construct. They are restoring the house of God and the worship of God. So we see, as I mentioned, this was a time of great celebration, a time of great rejoicing. But for many of the priests, we're told that there were priests, there were Levites, and there were some of the heads of the families who were in Jerusalem to see the laying of this foundation, who had also been alive to see the temple before its destruction. These would have been very old people at this time. They remembered in great detail what that original temple looked like. They remembered its dimensions. They remembered its opulence. Well, this chapter tells us that they wept over the side of this foundation being laid. Well, Haggai chapter 2 and verse 3 tells us why they wept. And the reason for this is because although they were following many of the plans that had been set forth during the time of David and Solomon, they were not constructing this temple back to the original size and original opulence. This second temple was going to be a far cry from the beauty of that first temple. Now there's a lot of speculations as to why that was, but ultimately what it came down to is as they were constructing this temple, they began to recognize, this is not as great as we thought it was going to be. We thought everything, and basically this was their mentality. We're going to go back to Jerusalem and we're going to get everything back exactly the way it was before. Now, those of you that are here that have ever, restored a vehicle or restored an old quilt or restored a house, are you ever able to get it back exactly how it was when it was new? No. You can get it pretty close. You can make it look good, but it's never going to be exactly the same. Well, so many of these Jews, by their understanding, they thought, we're going to go back to Jerusalem and we're going to pick up everything exactly the way we left off. We're going to rebuild everything exactly the way that it was. and life is going to go back to the way it was before we went to Babylon. Folks, life changes. You know, we talked a little bit Sunday about the fact that people have always kind of had the mentality, if I repent of my sins, God's going to forgive me and God's also going to take away those consequences. This is an excellent example. Did God forgive the Jews when they repented in Babylon? Yes. If he hadn't, he wouldn't let them go back. But he was not going to let them go back and have everything exactly the way that it was before. There was constantly going to be that reminder in front of them. You know what? Things aren't the way it was before because we messed up. We sinned. We turned away from God. Yes, God has forgiven us. God has let us come back and have a second chance. But things aren't going to be exactly the way they were before. There's going to be scars. And this temple was going to be one of those scars. It wasn't going to be as grand. And so we notice, on one hand, you had many people who were excited. They were rejoicing. A lot of people say, well, those more than likely were the younger people, and that does make sense. Ones that didn't fully understand exactly what they were seeing and experiencing. But then you had the older folks, those who had been there before, those who knew what life was like before, and who were now recognizing life's not going to be that way again. They're sad. They're upset by this. Yes, they're thankful that God has been merciful toward them, that He's given them a second chance. But they're saddened. They're upset. Because things are not going to be exactly the way they had anticipated. Any questions or comments up to this point? That's going to bring us to the end of Ezra chapter 3. Anything at all? All right, well, let's move into chapter 4. Well, as I mentioned earlier in the lesson tonight, as the Jews began rebuilding the temple, it didn't take very long for their enemies to notice the flurry of activity that was taking place in Jerusalem, and they decided pretty quickly that they were going to have to take action to try to stop this. Well, Ezra chapter 4 shows us the challenge that they had to face. But also, Ezra chapter 4 has a lesson for us. It shows us just how challenging it is to endure opposition. So let's look at the first two verses. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we seek your God as you do, and we have sacrificed to him since the days of Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who brought us here." Well, if you jump down to verse 10 for just a moment, notice it tells us who these adversaries are. These adversaries were people who had been taken captive by Assyria. What nation had been conquered by Assyria? We just mentioned it a while ago. Just to the north of Judah, it was Israel. Israel, their cousins to the north, had been conquered by Assyria. But we find that eventually what had taken place, this land that had been known as Israel, was given the name Samaria. You may remember Samaria was the capital city of Israel when that nation was in power. The Assyrians, when they claimed that territory, they gave the entire territory the name Samaria. So what happened was when all of these people were captured and taken back to Assyria, the Assyrian king went through and assigned different groups of people to go and inhabit different areas of the Assyrian Empire. And so some of those people who had been residents of Israel, who had been conquered by Assyria, were sent back to this land now known as Samaria, and they were allowed to resettle as Assyrian citizens. They were not given freedom to go back and reestablish their society. They were completely under the control of Assyria. Well, these people, by the time the New Testament comes along, had come to be known as Samaritans. Now, one of the things that is important for us to remember, I'll get your question in just a second. These were individuals who were not interested in maintaining their genetic purity. They were not that interested in keeping their tribal identities together. You remember God, He dissolved those 10 tribes to the north. They weren't allowed to go by their tribal entities. And so what happened was they began to assimilate themselves into Assyrian culture. They began to intermarry either with Assyrians or with captives from other countries. And so this is why, by the time the New Testament comes along, the Jews considered the Samaritans what? Half-breeds. These are half-breeds. They're not worth our time. They're not worth our attention. In fact, the Jews would not even set foot in Samaria unless they absolutely had to. All right.
So you're telling, I want to make sure I get this right. When they assigned these people to go to the different areas, they actually went back to Israel, what was originally Israel.
Some of them were sent back to what was Israel.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So but because they were under the Sumerian god or lord or whatever you call king.
Under the king, yes.
Then they, even though they went back to the same location as Israel, they were still having to practice Sumerian.
Exactly. Okay. I mean, they were in an Assyrian region known as Samaria, kind of like we live in an American state known as Arkansas.
Yeah.
And so while we are under the leadership of our president and Congress and what have you, I'm sure, each city probably had their leaders, each region probably had their leaders, but ultimately they were under the main oversight of the king of Assyria. So they come to their neighbors that have come back, their cousins, and they say, hey, we see you're rebuilding the temple. We want to help you out. We're worshiping the same God that you worship. We've been offering sacrifices to Him ever since we've been back here. Ever since we got back from Assyrian captivity and we've been back here in Samaria, we've been offering sacrifices to God. Well, first and foremost, were those sacrifices acceptable to God? Why? Because they weren't in Jerusalem. They weren't at the temple. And so they come down, they say they want to help. And while it is true that these people had been offering sacrifices, we find that their worship was seen by God as being corrupt. Because they were not following the law of Moses in the way that it had been set forth. 2 Kings 17, 29 through 32 talks about the fact that they continued to practice idolatry along with following a corrupted form of the law of Moses. And so while they were claiming to serve and honor God, God didn't see it that way. And sadly, there are a lot of people in the world around us today who believe that they are serving God and they are worshiping God appropriately, but folks, God doesn't see it that way. If we are not following God's will, then our service to God is not acceptable. Our service to God is vain. It's corrupt. And so you have this group of people who have already moved away from God and their worship practices, who have already broken the law of Moses by intermarrying with these nations that they're not allowed to marry into. Now they're coming and they're saying, well, we want to partner with you. We want to get this back the way that it was before we divided. We want to work together with you because we're serving the same God. Really what they were desiring was to have a shared interest in that project. They didn't want just these people from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin to have the credit for rebuilding the temple. They wanted this acclaim for themselves. But you see, God, before the Jews ever left Babylon, one of the things that they had been commanded was that they were to remain distinct from all other nations. They were not to ally themselves with, they were not to intermarry with, they were not to partner with any other nations. So the Jewish leaders responded this way in verse 3. You may do nothing with us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. Well, the request was denied. And it seems that there were at least two reasons for this rejection. First, it was because they recognized that these people were not really on their side. That they really weren't there to help in the way that they are saying that they are desiring to help. But also, rebuilding the temple was a responsibility that was given only to the Jews. It was not entrusted to anyone else. Only the Jews were to carry out this task. We see this in Ezra 1, verses 3 through 4, in that decree of Cyrus, when he told them that they could go back. But we also find that God had warned them in Exodus 34 and also Deuteronomy chapter 7 that if they were going to be faithful to Him, that they could not ally themselves with pagan countries. Well, these were individuals who claimed to be worshiping the God of heaven, but they were also worshiping idols. And so they would have been sinning if they had allied themselves with these people. Well, this was something that their ancestors had failed to obey in the past. And quite possibly the memory of those failures is what kept them from falling prey to this once again. So we're going to stop there. And Lord willing, next Wednesday night we'll pick up there in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 4.